The metal cage rattled violently as the truck bounced along a muddy back road. Rain pelted the roof in hard bursts, drowning out the whimpering sounds inside. Curled in the corner, trembling with exhaustion and fear, was a lion cub, no more than 2 months old, ribs showing, eyes swollen from infection. His golden fur was patchy, matted from weeks of neglect. He had no name, no mother, no idea that his life was about to change. 100 miles away, in a separate illegal compound near the Montana border, a young bear cub clawed at the corners of a rusty shed. He had been torn from the wild weeks earlier, likely after his mother had been killed by poachers. The cub paced in circles, desperate for something familiar, something warm. Each night, he cried until his throat went raw. Both were victims of the same cruelty, animals taken not for survival or science, but for vanity, power, and trade. The lion was destined for a private collector overseas. The bear? Likely to be sold as an exotic pet. Neither would have survived the month. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. An anonymous tip to wildlife authorities set off a chain of events that would alter 2 lives forever. Within 48 hours, rescue teams raided both facilities. The lion cub was found limp and barely breathing. The bear cub hissed and bit when the cage door opened, still filled with the wild spirit his captors couldn't take from him. They were transported separately, treated at different wildlife rehab centers. But both were eventually relocated to a quiet sanctuary in northern Wyoming, a place that specialized in emergency exotic animal rescues. That's where they met. The lion arrived first. Still weak but recovering, he was placed in a holding pen beside the nursery enclosure. The caregivers named him Tiamu, meaning sweet in Swahili. He barely responded to touch. He often sat with his head low, staring blankly at the far wall, as if waiting for someone who would never return. A few days later, the bear cub arrived. Bigger and stronger than Tiamu, but equally scarred inside. The staff named him Bo, short for Bodhi Awakening. At first, they were kept apart. Different species, different origins, different temperaments. But something strange happened. Bo began watching Tiamu through the mesh divider, pawing gently at the fence instead of growling. Tiamu, in turn, didn't flinch like he did with humans. He looked back, not afraid. One evening, as the staff were closing up for the night, Tiamu limped to the edge of his enclosure and curled near the mesh. Bo slowly walked to the same spot, and without hesitation, lay down parallel to the lion, only inches apart. 2 orphans. 2 wounded souls. 1 moment of silent understanding. That night, for the first time since arriving, Tiamu didn't cry. Neither did Bo. By the 3rd week, the staff could no longer ignore it. Something extraordinary was happening. At first, it had been subtle. Bo the bear cub began waking earlier, padding over to the shared fence and waiting there. Sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. Tiamu the lion cub would do the same, rising slowly on still tender legs and settling near Bo with a soft grunt of recognition. It wasn't just comfort. It wasn't just proximity. It was presence. "Have you ever seen anything like it?" whispered Megan, one of the rehab workers, as she quietly filmed the pair through the observation glass. "Nope," replied Diego, the head caretaker. "Different continents. Different species. But look at them, like littermates." Eventually, the decision was made. They were placed in the same recovery enclosure. It was a risk, albeit a carefully managed one. Both cubs were still young, both underweight, both emotionally dependent. But the sanctuary believed in healing through connection, and if these 2 could help each other recover, why not? The moment the barrier opened, the staff held their breath. Bo took the first step forward, sniffing the air cautiously. His big paws crunched softly on the hay-strewn floor. Tiamu, slower and more cautious, blinked twice before following. Bo let out a low chuffing sound, a bear's version of a non-threatening greeting. Tiamu responded by stretching out one paw toward him. They touched noses. Tentatively, at first. Then Bo let out a grunt and toppled onto his side with a huff. Tiamu, startled, jumped slightly, but then, as if recognizing the invitation, let out a breathy little huff of his own and curled up against Bo's warm fur. That afternoon, they napped together in a sunbeam. From that moment, they were inseparable. Days became weeks. The sanctuary staff grew used to seeing the odd pair curled up together like mismatched siblings. TMU would lick Bo's ears. Bo would nudge TMU upright when it was feeding time. They played as cubs do, tumbling, wrestling, chasing imaginary prey. TMU was faster, more agile. Bo had strength and endurance. But they never hurt each other, never roared or growled in real anger. Megan often joked, they're like yin and yang, wild opposites, perfect balance. But it was more than play. Their bond had depth. One cold night, a sudden lightning storm swept through the valley. The wind howled, thunder cracked, and the power went out for over an hour. Cameras went offline. Staff rushed to check on all the animals. When the lights finally returned and the screens flickered back on, what they saw on the monitor made even the senior staff fall silent. Bo was curled protectively around TMU, who had buried his face beneath the bear's chest, shivering with fear. Bo's eyes were wide and alert, scanning the room, every muscle tense, not for himself, but for his friend. That image, of the lion who had lost everything, finding safety not in a pride but in a bear's embrace, spread quietly through sanctuary circles. It became a symbol of resilience, of trauma healed not through time, but through trust. As the cubs grew, so did their enclosure. A full acre of open land, climbing logs, swimming holes, shady trees, and warm dens. Bo loved the water, splashing wildly every morning as if washing away old memories. TMU, ever the dignified observer, stayed near the rocks, but occasionally leapt in after Bo, only to regret it seconds later. They still slept curled together. Still touched noses in the morning. Still played with the reckless joy of creatures who had found a second chance. But nature, ever watchful, was beginning to shift around them. Bo's claws were longer. His gait was heavier. He began scaling trees, testing heights. TMU's frame had thickened. His eyes, once soft, now glowed with the faint gleam of a maturing predator. He began stalking small birds from a distance, crouching low with instincts he didn't fully understand. The staff knew what this meant. The wild was calling. And soon, no matter how close they were, no matter how strong the bond, they would have to make a choice. By the time spring arrived in the sanctuary valley, the once fragile cubs had grown into strong, restless juveniles. TMU's golden mane had just begun to show its first wisps around his neck, a soft halo that caught the morning sun. Bo the bear had thickened considerably. His shoulders had broadened, his gait now heavy with early signs of power. But they still played like cubs. Bo would lumber after TMU with exaggerated clumsiness, swiping playfully as TMU darted just out of reach. Their games had evolved. They no longer simply tumbled like kittens, but mimicked the instincts buried deep in their DNA. TMU would crouch, tail twitching, stalking invisible prey, or sometimes Bo. The bear, in return, had learned to fake a charge, stop inches from TMU, and let out a delighted snort when the lion leapt skyward in theatrical terror. They were growing up. But they were growing up together. The sanctuary expanded their enclosure again, this time adding a shallow stream with boulders and muddy patches. Bo took to the water instantly, pawing at fish, rolling in the cool mud like a child in a sandbox. TMU watched the first few days with disdain. Then one day, when Bo was particularly smug about his muddy conquest, TMU lunged, and the chase began. The lion darted, slipped, lunged, and finally, splat! Into the water he went, fur soaked, dignity wounded. Bo let out a deep hoof that sounded suspiciously like laughter. From that day, water games became a regular feature of their friendship. Megan, who now visited them every morning and evening, kept a journal of their behaviors. "They're more than friends," she wrote one night. "It's like they chose each other when they had no one else. They don't just survive together, they thrive." But as much joy as their days brought, subtle changes were beginning to show. Bo had become more territorial, rubbing against certain trees, sniffing the air with more intensity. He would occasionally growl low if a staff member came too close during feeding. His appetite had increased. He began climbing trees with more skill and would spend hours at the highest perch, scanning the far ridgelines of the sanctuary. TMU, too, had changed. The lion was quieter now, his movements more calculated. He spent longer stretches alone near the rocks, watching birds and small critters that dared to enter the enclosure. Once, Megan caught him crouched low, tail flicking, eyes laser-focused on a squirrel. He didn't pounce, but something in his body language had changed. Instincts were awakening. One evening, a nearby mountain lion cried out in the wild, a piercing, otherworldly sound. TMU stopped mid-play, ears perked, eyes wide. He stared toward the trees for several long minutes before returning to Bo, pressing his head into the bear's side. Bo didn't move, just sat still, wrapping a paw gently over TMU's shoulders. Diego called a staff meeting 2 days later. "I know none of us want this," he said softly, holding up the latest health reports and behavioral charts, "but they're nearing the age when rewilding discussions begin." "Together?" Megan asked, hopeful. Diego shook his head. "Bo's a native species. If his instincts remain sharp, he could be released into protected forest zones nearby. But TMU, he's African. He'll never survive here in the wild. His best chance is transfer to the South African reserve we've worked with before." Silence fell over the room. "Do we separate them?" someone finally whispered. Diego looked at Megan, then out the window toward the enclosure. "We might not have a choice. The wild calls differently for each of them." That night, TMU and Bo curled up beneath their favorite tree. The stars were bright overhead, and the wind carried distant night sounds, owls, frogs, and something else, something primal. Bo snored softly. TMU stayed awake a little longer, staring at the trees. He didn't understand the words or what the staff had planned. But in his bones, he felt it. The shift. The beginning of something ending. He leaned his head against Bo's side and closed his eyes. And Bo, as if sensing his friend's unease, tightened his massive paw around him. Morning sunlight dripped through the trees like honey, casting golden beams across the enclosure floor. It looked peaceful, ordinary, even. But something was different. Bo stood with his front paws up on the log platform, sniffing the wind. His ears twitched. He let out a low huff and glanced back toward the gate. TMU was watching him silently from beneath their favorite tree, his tail swishing with unease. That morning, the sanctuary team had begun building a new partition. It wasn't just a maintenance upgrade. It was a preparation. 2 weeks had passed since the team decided Bo and TAMU's futures would part. The veterinary and wildlife advisors had confirmed that Bo's behavior was growing wild enough to consider a reintroduction trial. Meanwhile, the sanctuary had received word, a South African reserve had space, and a pride of orphan lions with whom TMU could be slowly integrated. Both options were best-case scenarios. But not together. Diego stood outside the enclosure, clipboard in hand, as Megan entered with a gentle voice and 2 bowls of food. TMU ignored his. Bo ate half, then walked over to TMU, nudging the untouched bowl with his snout. TMU gave a soft, frustrated growl, not at Bo, but at everything. Megan noticed the change. "TMU's acting more withdrawn," she told Diego later. "Less playful. He's pacing now. I think he knows." "Bo?" Diego asked. Megan shook her head. "Bo's doing the opposite. Exploring more. Marking. He even challenged a wild coyote near the fence. Didn't hurt it, just roared. Scared it half to death." The enclosure they'd grown up in now had clear boundaries. Invisible lines. The scent of change hung in the air like smoke. That week, the sanctuary team started introducing Bo to smells from the forest beyond. They scattered pine needles, bear scat, feathers, and fur of wild prey, tools meant to awaken and fine-tune his instincts. He took to it easily. One evening, Megan watched Bo dig into a mound of leaves to uncover a buried fish carcass the staff had hidden. TMU tried the same the next day, half-heartedly, but left it untouched. He was trying to understand a world that didn't belong to him. Later that week, a tall wire corridor was extended from Bo's enclosure to the edge of the sanctuary's wild buffer zone. It was called the Soft Gate. Once opened, Bo would be free to leave on his own, or stay if he wasn't ready. TMU stared at it. He walked to the edge and sniffed it daily. Megan caught him watching Bo on the other side, Bo who had already begun pacing the new corridor with excitement. Their worlds were pulling apart inch by inch. That night, Megan stayed late. She watched from a distance as Bo climbed the central log, something he hadn't done in weeks, and let out a deep rumbling growl toward the stars. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't play. It was a call. TMU remained in the shadows, unmoving. Eventually, Bo lumbered back down and pressed his face into TMU's mane. The lion didn't flinch. They lay beside each other in silence. In her journal, Megan wrote, "They don't need language. They already know. And neither wants to be the one to break it. The next day, the team ran a test. They opened the soft gate to Bo's half of the enclosure, letting the scent of freedom spill in. Bo approached slowly, then turned around. He didn't leave. He walked back to TAMU. But Megan knew that wouldn't last forever. The wild had arrived. It was just waiting for the right moment. The sun broke through the trees with unusual sharpness that morning, everything crisp, golden, and too still. The sanctuary team had prepared for this day for over a month. But no one felt ready. Especially not TAMU. Bo was already pacing by the soft gate. His movements were charged, focused. He had barely touched breakfast. His instincts were louder now, echoing inside him like thunder. Last night, he had tested the far fence 3 times. Not out of frustration, but anticipation. He was ready. TAMU wasn't. The lion cub, though not so little anymore, sat in the shaded corner of their enclosure, eyes locked on Bo. He hadn't played. Hadn't stretched. Hadn't roared. He just watched. Megan noticed first. They didn't sleep next to each other last night, she whispered to Diego as they stood behind the observation glass. First time in nearly a year. By midday, the team opened the soft gate. Bo didn't hesitate. He stepped through it like a soldier marching into purpose. Then he stopped, turned his head, and looked back. Right at TAMU. The lion didn't move. But his tail thumped against the ground, just once. Bo let out a low, expressive huff, almost a chuff, a sound Megan had never heard from him before. Then, he turned back and disappeared into the narrow corridor that led to the first gate of the wild. TAMU stood. He walked to the fence dividing their halves. He pressed his face into the mesh. No growl. No cry. Just breathing. Hours passed. Bo had been fitted with a tracking collar days ago. The team monitored his progress via drone and motion sensors. He was moving slowly, cautiously, pausing to sniff, to listen, to test his world. By sunset, he had reached the edge of the forest. He looked back once. There was no one there. And then he stepped into the trees. That night, the sanctuary was quiet. Megan stayed late. Again. She found TAMU curled beside the gate Bo had exited from, his body tense but unmoving. She didn't call his name. She didn't need to. He knew she was there. She sat down quietly near the viewing fence. "He's okay," she said softly. "He's free." TAMU didn't respond. But he lifted his head, and for a moment, his eyes didn't look like a lion's. They looked like something deeply human. Lonely. Lost. But understanding. The gate clicked shut at midnight. In the weeks that followed, the separation sank deeper into TAMU. He grew quiet. The playful cub who had once chased butterflies and pounced on Bo's tail now walked in slow, measured steps. He still ate. Still trained with Megan. But his energy was dimmed, as if something essential had been unplugged. The team moved forward with his transfer to Africa. The final medical checks were done. His papers cleared. The transport date was set. Megan visited him one last evening alone. She brought a thick blanket Bo used to sleep on. Not for smell, those had faded, but for memory. She laid it near the tree they once shared. TAMU sniffed it, then sat beside it. He didn't curl into it. He didn't lie down. He just sat. As if guarding it. Or waiting. Then came the unexpected alert. Bo's tracker had gone dark. The team scrambled. Was it a malfunction? An attack? A den collapse? Drone footage showed movement in the area near his last ping, but the terrain was dense. Too dangerous for humans to enter casually. They waited 48 hours before considering recovery. Then, on the third morning, a wildlife camera near the forest perimeter lit up. There he was. Bo. Alive. Healthy. Stronger than ever. And he wasn't alone. At the sanctuary, Megan watched the footage on repeat. The image was unmistakable, Bo standing at the edge of the tree line. And behind him, another shape. A second bear, possibly wild. Maybe a mate. Maybe a companion. Bo had found his place. And still, he had returned to the edge of the sanctuary. Just for a while. Watching. Remembering. TAMU had sensed it too. He spent the entire night standing near the gate, staring at the trees, his tail still, his ears forward. And when morning came, he roared once, loud and long, before turning away. It was not a roar of grief. It was a goodbye. The air was heavy with stillness as the sun began to rise over the sanctuary for the last time in TMU's chapter here. It cast soft orange rays across the enclosure where he had spent so many months, laughing, playing, learning to trust again. But this morning, it felt like a dream fading with the dawn. Today, he would leave. Today, the lion who had once cried out like an orphaned cub would return to the land of his ancestors. TMU was unusually calm. Megan noticed it immediately. The restless pacing, the anxious sniffing, the backward glances, none of it was there. He stood tall at the edge of the crate, watching the handlers with quiet understanding. There was no fear in his golden eyes. Only memory. He paused before stepping in. Then looked over his shoulder, toward the tree line. He waited. Only silence answered. And then, as if accepting something unspoken, he stepped into the crate with regal ease. The gate clicked shut. The journey was long. The flight across oceans, the temperature changes, the shifting scents. But through it all, TMU remained composed. The wildlife team receiving him in Kenya noted his remarkable poise. "He's different," one said. "He's already got the heart of the wild." They released him onto a private reserve designed for rescued big cats. It was fenced but vast, hundreds of acres of thick brush, tall grass, sun-soaked rock, and room to roam. But TMU didn't run. Not at first. He stood just outside the crate, head raised to the wind. His nose twitched. He closed his eyes. And for a moment, he looked like he was listening. For a chuff. A huff. A growl from behind some tree he'd left behind. But all he heard were distant birds and rustling grass. He didn't mourn. He moved. TMU walked with purpose, his large paws quiet on the earth. He claimed no territory, yet. He didn't roar. He didn't chase anything. He just moved, like a lion retracing a dream. The team monitoring him called it adjustment. Megan called it memory. Back at the sanctuary, weeks passed. Bo didn't return again. But Megan knew better than to assume the bond was broken. Bonds like theirs, born of survival and soul, weren't made to be severed. Only stretched. She placed a new camera near the same forest line where Bo had last appeared. 4 days, nothing. Then one morning, after a heavy rain, the footage flickered in. A bear. Just one. It was Bo. He stepped into the edge of the clearing. Alone. His coat glistening with dew, his eyes alert but calm. He walked to the old fence post and sat. He stared. Not at the buildings. Not at the food area. But at the gate. The one TMU had walked through last. He stayed there for hours. And then slowly, he turned and walked back into the woods. In Kenya, TMU began to settle. He'd begun to roar again, softly at first, then louder. He stalked prey, pounced in mock chases, climbed rocks at sunset. He was becoming what he was always meant to be. And yet, sometimes, he would sit at the highest ridge, where he could see the open horizon, and stay for hours. His tail still. His breath steady. Watching the trees. Waiting, it seemed, for something. Or someone. No one could explain what happened next. One afternoon, while reviewing satellite tracking for wildlife migration, a conservationist spotted something strange. Images of a large animal moving steadily south. Not unusual. But the shape, the gait, the bulk. It was a bear. In Kenya. At first, they thought it impossible. But Bo's collar had pinged twice briefly, along a route mapped by sanctuary officials. And the second ping was days later. Not in North America. But near the Kenyan coast. Someone had helped him. Somehow, Bo had crossed an ocean. They didn't meet that day. Not yet. But one dusk, a lion sat on the ridge. The wind shifted. He lifted his nose. And chuffed. Not a roar. Not a cry. A chuff. From deep in his chest. Like an old hello. A soft rustle below answered. The trees parted. And there, just at the edge of the clearing, stood a bear. Older. Bigger. But unmistakably, Bo. They didn't run to each other. They didn't need to. They simply walked side by side. Into the brush. Into the wild. Into whatever came next. Together. Some friendships defy all odds, even species, oceans, and the wild itself. Tamu and Bo were never meant to meet. A lion and a bear, from different worlds, torn from their homes. But in their pain, they found each other. In their friendship, they found healing. And when the world tried to separate them, the wild called, but love answered louder. If this story moved you, remember, sometimes the most powerful bonds in life are the ones we never expect, and never forget. Paw Prince, would you have let them go? Or fought to stay together? Speech balloons, share your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. Pushpin, subscribe to for more stories that prove the wild has a heart, and sometimes it remembers.